December 22, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. Snow fell without sound. It covered the bodies in white, made the blood look almost black against the frozen ground, turned the shattered trees into monuments of ice. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. Men died from their wounds before they could freeze. Others froze before they could bleed out. The forest had been burning for 3 months. American and German forces had been tearing each other apart in a landscape that offered no mercy to either side. Artillery had turned the earth into a crater field. Mines waited beneath every footstep. Trees exploded when shells hit them, sending splinters of wood through flesh as efficiently as any shrapnel. In this hell, the wounded screamed in English and German. The sound was identical. Medical stations on both sides faced the same mathematics of despair. Too many wounded. Too few surgeons. Too little blood plasma. Too few bandages. Too many hours in the operating tent before the hands stopped working properly, before the mind started making mistakes, before another soldier died on the table because there simply wasn't enough of anything to save everyone. Captain John Mitchell, U.S. Army Medical Corps, had been operating for 16 hours straight. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette outside the aid station. He was 29 years old. He looked 50. "How many did we lose today?" his assistant asked. Mitchell didn't answer immediately. He watched the snow fall. "I stopped counting." 300 yards away, across what the maps called a front line, but what soldiers simply called death, German medical officer Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in almost the same posture, smoking in almost the same silence. He had trained at Heidelberg. He had believed in the precision of surgery, in the clarity of medical science, in the possibility of saving lives through skill and knowledge. The forest had taught him differently. The forest taught everyone the same lesson, regardless of language or uniform. In the end, human bodies broke in identical ways. Blood was always red. Screams always sounded the same. The protocols were clear on both sides. You treated your own wounded first. Enemy casualties came second, if at all. You didn't fraternize with the enemy. You didn't show weakness. You maintained the fiction that the men trying to kill each other were fundamentally different, that this difference justified the killing. But in the medical tents, that fiction became harder to maintain. A compound fracture looked the same in German and English. Shock presented identically in every language. Gangrene didn't care about nationality. Pain recognized no borders. Some of the German wounded spoke English. Some of the American wounded spoke German. Their families had immigrated a generation earlier, or their grandparents had come from the same villages that were now being destroyed. They prayed in similar words to the same God, asking for the same mercy. The medics noticed. They didn't speak about it. But they noticed. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the shelling stopped. Both sides agreed to an unofficial truce, not a formal ceasefire, just a recognition that even in war, there were moments when continuing to kill seemed obscene. The forest filled with an unfamiliar sound, silence. Men on both sides heard it differently. Some felt relief. Some felt suspicion. Some felt an emptiness worse than the noise of battle, because the silence made them think about what they had done, what had been done to them, what they would do again when morning came. Mitchell walked the perimeter of the American position. He could hear German voices across the frozen ground. They were singing a Christmas carol. The melody drifted through the ice-covered trees like something from another world, a world where men didn't shoot each other, didn't watch each other die in the mud. He recognized the tune. His grandmother had sung it. His grandmother had come from Bavaria in 1889. The singing stopped. The silence returned. In that silence, Mitchell heard something else, a voice, calling in broken English, asking for help. The voice came from no man's land. No man's land wasn't marked on any map. It had no official boundaries, no defined dimensions. It was simply the space between the armies, the territory that belonged to death. Mines lay hidden beneath the snow. Trip wires waited in the darkness. Snipers watched from positions on both sides, ordered to shoot anything that moved. And yet, the voice called again. Help. Please. Help. Mitchell stood motionless. His medical training demanded one thing. His survival instinct demanded another. His orders demanded a third. He was a captain in the United States Army. He was a doctor who had taken an oath. He was a man who had already seen too many people die. His assistant appeared beside him. "Don't," the young man said quietly. "It's not worth it. He's wounded. He's German." "He's wounded," Mitchell repeated. They stood in the snow, not speaking. The voice called again, weaker now. Mitchell realized the man was losing consciousness. In another few minutes, hypothermia would finish what the wound had started. Mitchell made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward, into no man's land, his hands raised, a white cloth tied to a branch he had picked up from the ground. He moved slowly, deliberately, making himself visible, making himself a target if anyone chose to fire. Nothing happened. The snipers watched but didn't shoot. Perhaps they recognized the red cross on his helmet. Perhaps they recognized the futility of killing a medic who was trying to save an enemy. Perhaps they were simply too tired of killing. He found the wounded man 20 yards from the American line. German uniform. Barely conscious. A stomach wound that would be fatal without surgery. Mitchell knelt in the snow and began the initial assessment, his training taking over, his hands moving automatically despite the cold, despite the risk, despite everything that war had taught him about the cost of compassion. He heard movement behind him. He turned, expecting to see his assistant. Instead, he saw a German medic approaching from the opposite direction, also with his hands raised, also carrying a white flag improvised from torn cloth. They stared at each other across the body of the wounded man. The German medic was young, perhaps 22 or 23. He wore glasses that were cracked on one side. His uniform was covered in dried blood that wasn't his own. He looked as exhausted as Mitchell felt. Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann, the German said in accented English. Medical corpsman. Captain John Mitchell. Medical Corps. They crouched together over the wounded soldier. Mitchell examined the wound. Hartmann watched his hands, assessing his technique. After a moment, Hartmann reached into his medical bag and pulled out a pack of sulfa powder. "For infection," he said, offering it to Mitchell. Mitchell took it. Their fingers touched briefly. They were enemies. They were trying to save the same life. "He needs surgery," Mitchell said. "Internal bleeding. Maybe a severed artery." "Your station or mine?" Hartmann asked. The question hung in the frozen air. Both men understood the implications. Whichever aid station they chose would be admitting an enemy soldier, would be using precious supplies on someone who might, in a few days or weeks, return to killing their comrades. Both men understood that military law prohibited exactly what they were discussing. Both men also understood that the wounded soldier was dying. "Mine," Mitchell said. "It's closer." They carried the German soldier across no man's land together, moving slowly through the snow, careful of the mines they knew were hidden beneath the white surface. Mitchell called out in English as they approached the American lines. Hartmann called out in German toward his own side, explaining what was happening, asking them not to shoot. The American sentries stared in disbelief as their medical officer walked into camp carrying a German soldier, accompanied by a German medic. No one fired. No one quite knew what to do. This wasn't in the regulations. This wasn't in any training manual. This was something else entirely. Mitchell brought them to the operating tent. His surgical team stood frozen, waiting for orders that made sense of what they were witnessing. "He needs immediate surgery," Mitchell said. "Prepare for a laparotomy." "Sir," his assistant began, "he's German." "He's dying," Mitchell interrupted. "That's all that matters." Hartmann set down his medical bag. "I can assist," he said quietly. "If you permit." Mitchell looked at him. He thought about the regulations he was violating. He thought about the men he had watched die because there weren't enough hands, weren't enough hours, weren't enough miracles to save everyone. He thought about the oath he had taken to do no harm, to preserve life, to remember that before everything else, he was a physician. "Scrub in," he said. The surgery began at 0200 hours on Christmas Day, 1944. Inside the tent, the cold was less severe but still present. Their breath formed clouds in the dim light. The portable generator hummed, powering the surgical lamps that cast harsh shadows across the operating table. Steam rose from the bowls of hot water used to clean instruments between procedures. The wounded German soldier lay unconscious under anesthesia, precious morphine that Mitchell's unit could barely spare. His abdomen had been opened, revealing the damage. The bullet had entered below the ribcage, torn through the stomach lining, nicked the spleen, and lodged somewhere near the left kidney. Mitchell worked with the focused intensity of someone who had performed this surgery dozens of times in recent weeks. His hands moved steadily despite the exhaustion that made his eyes burn, despite the tremor in his fingers that he tried to ignore. Across the table, Hartmann assisted with the smooth competence of someone equally experienced in battlefield trauma. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The language of surgery was universal. A gesture toward the retractor. A nod toward the suction tube. A brief eye contact to coordinate the next step. They moved in synchronization, two strangers working as if they had trained together for years. Mitchell's surgical team watched in stunned silence. The scene before them contradicted everything they understood about war, about enemies, about the boundaries that weren't supposed to be crossed. And yet, what they witnessed wasn't chaos or treason or madness. It was simply two physicians doing what physicians were trained to do. After 40 minutes, they had repaired the stomach lining. After 90 minutes, they had removed the bullet and stopped the internal bleeding. After 2 hours, they were closing the incision with neat sutures that would hold if infection didn't set in, if shock didn't return, if the soldier's body remembered how to survive. Mitchell stepped back from the table, pulling off his blood-soaked gloves. Hartmann did the same. They looked at each other in the harsh light, seeing each other clearly for the first time. Not as enemies. Not as soldiers. As two men who had just spent 2 hours trying to prevent a death. "He will live?" Hartmann asked. "Maybe," Mitchell answered honestly. "The next 48 hours will tell. Thank you for allowing me to help. Thank you for helping." They stood in awkward silence, aware that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Mitchell's assistant approached, uncertain. "Sir, what do we do with him now?" "The German medic, I mean." Mitchell hadn't thought that far ahead. The adrenaline of surgery was fading, replaced by the cold reality of what had happened. He had allowed an enemy soldier into an American medical facility. He had shared medical supplies. He had worked alongside an enemy medic. Any of these actions could be considered collaboration with the enemy, could be grounds for court-martial. Before he could answer, they heard gunfire in the distance. The Christmas truce was ending. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the war would resume. Hartmann understood. "I should return," he said. "Wait." Mitchell moved to the supply cabinet. He pulled out several packages of sulfa powder, a roll of bandages, 2 bottles of morphine. "You'll need these." Hartmann stared at the supplies. "I cannot accept. Your men are wounded too. You're short on supplies, same as us." Mitchell pressed the medical supplies into Hartmann's hands. "Take them. This is not allowed." "None of this is allowed," Mitchell said. "But we did it anyway." Hartmann carefully packed the supplies into his medical bag. He looked at the German soldier on the operating table, still unconscious, still alive. "When the war ends," he said quietly, "perhaps we will meet again. Perhaps." They shook hands. It was a strange gesture, formal and absurd given the circumstances. But it felt necessary, a way of acknowledging what had happened here, what it meant. Mitchell walked Hartmann back through the camp. American soldiers watched them pass, too surprised or confused to challenge what they were seeing. At the edge of no man's land, they stopped. "One more thing," Hartmann said. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, wrote quickly, handed it to Mitchell. "If any of your wounded need blood plasma, signal with 3 flares at night. We have some. Not much, but some." Mitchell looked at the paper. It was a crude map showing the location of the German aid station. He folded it carefully, knowing he was now in possession of military intelligence that he should report, that could be used for artillery targeting, that could kill the man who had just helped save a life. "And if your wounded need morphine," Mitchell said, "signal the same way. We'll respond." They parted without further words. Hartmann disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, moving carefully through the snow, navigating the invisible paths between the mines. Mitchell watched until he could no longer distinguish the German medic from the shadows. He returned to the operating tent. His surgical team stood waiting, uncertain about what they had witnessed, uncertain about what would happen next. "No one speaks of this," Mitchell said. "Not to other units. Not in letters home. What happened here stays here. Understood?" They nodded. Not because they agreed with the orders, but because they understood the alternative. If word spread about what had occurred, Mitchell would face court-martial. They might all face charges. The fact that they had saved a life would be irrelevant compared to the fact that they had collaborated with the enemy. But as the night faded toward dawn, as the German soldier began showing signs of recovery, as the camp prepared for another day of war, something had fundamentally changed. Mitchell felt it. His team felt it. Even the soldiers who had only glimpsed what occurred sensed that something impossible had happened in that tent. The war hadn't stopped. The killing would continue. But for 2 hours on Christmas morning, in a medical tent in the Hürtgen Forest, two enemies had remembered that before they were soldiers, before they were Germans or Americans, they were healers. And healing recognized no borders. The morphine began to wear off. The German soldier's eyes opened. He saw American uniforms around him, saw the Red Cross on Mitchell's helmet, saw the tent above him that wasn't German. Confusion crossed his face, then fear, then something else, a dawning comprehension that he was alive when he should be dead, that he was being cared for when he should be a prisoner, that somehow, impossibly, the rules had changed. "You're going to be all right," Mitchell told him in careful German, words he remembered from his grandmother. "You're safe here." The soldier closed his eyes. Whether from pain or relief or disbelief, Mitchell couldn't tell. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. Against all probability, against all logic of war, he would see another sunrise. Outside, the first shells of the new day began to fall. 3 nights later, Mitchell stood outside the operating tent and watched 3 red flares arc into the sky from the German position. He understood immediately. They needed blood plasma. They were signaling for help across a battlefield where help wasn't supposed to cross, where every supply was measured against strategic value, where helping the enemy meant extending the war. His surgical team gathered around him, waiting for orders. They had all heard about the Christmas night surgery. Some approved. Some had reservations. All of them understood that Mitchell had been changed by it, that something in him had broken or awakened, and that whatever happened next would define who they all were beyond this war. "Sir," his assistant asked quietly. "What do we do?" Mitchell thought about the regulations. About military law. About the court-martial that could follow. About the career he would lose, the life he had planned, the future that depended on following orders without question. He thought about the German soldier recovering in their camp, eating American rations, speaking broken English with the guards, showing them pictures of his family in Hamburg. He thought about how the guards had started treating him less like an enemy and more like a patient, how they brought him extra blankets at night, how they shared cigarettes with him despite regulations against fraternizing. He thought about Hartmann's cracked glasses, his exhausted eyes, his hands that moved with the same desperate competence that Mitchell felt every time he operated, knowing there would never be enough time, enough supplies, enough miracles to save everyone. "Load the plasma into packs," Mitchell said. "We're going to deliver it." "Sir, that's—" "I know what it is," Mitchell interrupted. "Load the plasma." They moved in darkness, for medics carrying packs filled with blood plasma, morphine, and bandages. Mitchell led them across no man's land, following the route he had memorized from Hartmann's map. They moved slowly, testing each step, aware that one misplaced foot could trigger a mine, one wrong turn could put them in a sniper's sight line. The German sentries saw them coming. Voices called out in challenge. Mitchell responded in German, identifying himself, explaining their purpose. There was confusion on the German side, urgent discussions, someone running to get an officer. Hartmann appeared, moving quickly through the darkness. He stared at Mitchell and the other American medics, at the packs they carried, at the impossible fact that they had crossed into German territory carrying supplies for their enemies. "You came," Hartmann said, and Mitchell heard the disbelief in his voice. "You sent the signal. I did not think you would respond. I thought," he stopped, searching for words. "I thought it was too much to ask." "Show us where your wounded are," Mitchell said. The German aid station was smaller than the American one, more makeshift, more desperate. It had been shelled twice in the past week. Part of the tent had collapsed. Supplies were critically low. The wounded lay on stretchers placed too close together, and Mitchell could smell the gangrene before he entered. A German medical officer approached, older than Mitchell, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who had served in the previous war. He looked at the American medics with an expression Mitchell couldn't read. Suspicion. Hope. Exhaustion. All three at once. "I am Dr. Wilhelm Krauss," he said in perfect English. "I trained at Johns Hopkins in 1937. I am told you have brought plasma." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung between them. It was the same question Mitchell had been asking himself since Christmas night, the same question his team had asked, the same question that had no good answer in the context of war. "Because they're wounded," Mitchell finally said. "That's all that matters." Krauss studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, a gesture of understanding that transcended language, nationality, everything that war tried to use to separate people. "Come," he said. "I will show you our most critical cases." They worked together for 3 hours. Mitchell's team administered plasma to German soldiers who were dying from blood loss. They showed Krauss's medics the latest techniques for treating shock, for preventing infection, for keeping men alive in conditions that seemed designed for death. In return, the German medics shared their own techniques, tricks learned through necessity, adaptations born from shortage and desperation. At one point, Mitchell found himself working on a German soldier who couldn't have been more than 18. The boy had lost his left leg below the knee. The wound had been crudely dressed, infection had set in, and he was burning with fever. Mitchell cleaned the wound, administered morphine, applied fresh bandages with the precious sulfa powder that might prevent gangrene. The boy opened his eyes. "Americaner?" he whispered. "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question Krauss had asked. The same question everyone was asking. Mitchell didn't have a better answer than the one he had given before. "Because you're wounded," he said in German. "Sleep now." The boy closed his eyes. A tear ran down his cheek, though whether from pain or relief or confusion, Mitchell couldn't tell. As they prepared to leave, Krauss pulled Mitchell aside. "There is a British medic," he said quietly. "In the prisoner camp, 5 kilometers east. He is treating both prisoners and German wounded. The camp commander permits it because we are short of medical staff. If you can make contact." He trailed off, but Mitchell understood. There were others. Other medics who had crossed the lines, who had chosen patience over politics, who had remembered their oaths in the middle of hell. "We will try," Mitchell said. They made the return journey just before dawn. Behind them, German soldiers who should have been enemies stood at attention as the American medics departed. It was a strange farewell, silent, almost ceremonial, acknowledging something that had no name in military regulations. When they reached American lines, Mitchell's commanding officer was waiting. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel said, his voice carefully neutral. "I need to speak with you. Now." Mitchell followed him to the command tent. He knew what was coming. Someone had reported the unauthorized crossing into enemy territory. Someone had questioned the use of medical supplies for German soldiers. Someone had done their duty according to military law. The colonel closed the tent flap behind them. He stood for a moment, not speaking, organizing his thoughts. When he finally turned to face Mitchell, his expression was unreadable. "I've received 3 separate reports about your activities," the colonel said. "Treating enemy wounded. Sharing medical supplies. Unauthorized contact with German personnel. Any one of these could be grounds for court-martial." Mitchell said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had known the risk. He had crossed the line anyway. "I've also received something else," the colonel continued. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Intelligence report. The German aid station you visited last night treated 28 Allied prisoners in the past month. They used their limited supplies on our men. They performed surgeries on Americans who would have died otherwise." He paused, letting Mitchell absorb this information. "I don't know what you started out there, Captain. I don't know if it's brilliant or insane. What I do know is that we have 7 of our men alive right now because some German doctors chose to treat them instead of letting them die. 7 men who will go home to their families because someone on the other side remembered they were doctors first. He refolded the paper carefully. I'm not going to court-martial you. I'm not going to put a stop to whatever this is. But I need you to understand something. This cannot become official policy. This cannot be reported up the chain. This cannot become a story that other units hear about and try to replicate. Because if it does, headquarters will shut it down, and they will make an example of everyone involved. I understand, sir. Do you? The colonel's voice hardened. Because what you're doing is dangerous. Not just to your career, but to the fundamental structure of how armies work. If soldiers start seeing the enemy as people who can be saved instead of targets to be destroyed, the whole machinery of war begins to fail. And there are generals on both sides who would rather let wounded men die than allow that machinery to fail. Mitchell met his gaze. With respect, sir, I'm a doctor first. I know, the colonel said, and his voice softened. That's why I'm not stopping you. But be careful. Be smart. And for God's sake, keep this quiet. He dismissed Mitchell with a salute that felt more like a benediction than a military formality. Mitchell walked back to his tent as the sun rose over the Hürtgen Forest, turning the snow gold, making the destruction look almost beautiful. His surgical team was waiting, anxious about what had happened. Mitchell shook his head slightly, not now, not here. They understood. The silence would hold. But something had changed in that command tent, something more profound than Mitchell had anticipated. The colonel could have ended it all with a single order. Instead, he had given tacit approval to continue. Not because he believed in breaking the rules, but because he understood that in a war where humanity was being systematically destroyed, small acts of humanity might be the only thing worth preserving. That night, they sent 3 flares into the sky. The German side responded within minutes. The signal was acknowledged. The connection was established. In the darkness between the armies, a different kind of war was beginning. By February 1945, the network had spread beyond anything Mitchell had imagined. It began with whispered conversations between medics during brief ceasefires. It spread through hand-drawn maps passed between the lines, marking the locations of aid stations that would treat wounded regardless of uniform. It grew through signals, 3 red flares for plasma, 2 white flares for morphine, 1 green flare for surgical assistance. The British medic Krauss had mentioned, Lieutenant Thomas Ashworth of the Royal Army Medical Corps, made contact in early January. He had been captured at Arnhem, spent months in a prisoner camp treating both Allied prisoners and German wounded. When the front moved closer to the camp, he found himself in a strange position, nominally a prisoner, but effectively the only qualified surgeon for 20 miles in any direction. The German camp commander, Oberst Heinrich Vogel, had made a pragmatic decision. He allowed Ashworth to operate on German soldiers. In return, Ashworth demanded, and received, proper medical supplies for the Allied prisoners. Neither man spoke about the arrangement. Neither man reported it to their superiors. Both men understood they were violating regulations that seemed absurd when measured against the reality of wounded men dying for lack of care. Through Ashworth, the network connected to French resistance fighters who carried wounded across the lines. Through them, it reached civilian doctors in liberated villages who treated German soldiers in secret, risking execution by their own people for collaborating with the enemy. Through them, it expanded into something that wasn't quite a conspiracy and wasn't quite a rebellion, but something else entirely, a silent revolt against the idea that war required the abandonment of humanity. Mitchell learned about the scope of the network through a series of encounters that felt orchestrated by chance but were actually carefully coordinated. A French doctor appeared at his aid station carrying a German soldier with a chest wound. A Dutch nurse arrived with intelligence about a German medical train that carried both German and Allied wounded. A Polish partisan brought news of a field hospital where German and Russian medics worked side by side, treating soldiers who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier. Each encounter brought the same questions: why? How? Aren't you afraid? And each time, Mitchell gave the same answer: because they're wounded. That's all that matters. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing about war was ever that simple. In March, Mitchell received his first casualty who had been treated by German medics before crossing the lines. Private James Sullivan had been shot during a reconnaissance mission, captured by a German patrol, brought to a German aid station where his wounds were treated. When the front shifted, he was released, not exchanged through official channels, just quietly walked to American lines with a note pinned to his uniform explaining the medical procedures that had been performed. The note was signed by Hauptmann Weber, the same German medical officer Mitchell had heard about through Krauss. Weber had earned a reputation among both German and American medics as someone who would treat any wounded soldier regardless of nationality, who had performed dozens of surgeries on Allied prisoners, who had shared his own limited supplies with men who wore enemy uniforms. Sullivan recovered. Before he was evacuated to a hospital in England, he sat with Mitchell and told his story. "They saved my life," he said simply. "I know they're Germans. I know what we're fighting against. But those medics, they just saw a wounded soldier. They didn't see the uniform." Mitchell wrote a report about Sullivan's treatment. He didn't mention the network. He didn't mention the signals or the maps or the quiet cooperation that was spreading along the front. He simply noted that the wounded soldier had received appropriate medical care from enemy personnel, and that this should be acknowledged. The report never received a response. Mitchell suspected it had been quietly filed away, too complicated for the military bureaucracy to process, too dangerous to acknowledge, too embarrassing to punish. But word spread anyway. Other medics heard about Sullivan. They heard about the German aid stations that would treat American wounded. They heard about the British doctors treating German soldiers. They heard about the signals in the darkness, the maps passed between enemies, the morphine and plasma that crossed the lines when no one was watching. Some approved. Some were horrified. Many were simply confused by the contradiction. How could you help the enemy and still be winning the war? How could you save the life of someone who might return to killing your comrades? Mitchell wrestled with these questions every day. He had no good answers. He only knew that when he saw a wounded soldier, German or American or British or any of the dozens of nationalities being ground up in the war, he saw a patient. Everything else was commentary. In April, as the war entered its final weeks, Mitchell received orders to report to divisional headquarters. He assumed it was finally coming, the court-martial, the questions he couldn't answer, the price for crossing too many lines. Instead, he found himself in a room with a colonel he had never met, a man with tired eyes who looked like he had stopped sleeping sometime in 1943. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel began, "I've been reading reports about your unit. Unusual reports. Reports about medical cooperation with enemy personnel." Mitchell said nothing. There was no defense that would sound reasonable in a military context. "I've also been reading casualty figures," the colonel continued. "Your sector has the lowest rate of deaths from wounds in the entire division. Significantly lower than other medical units. Some of your wounded are receiving treatment faster than should be possible given our supply lines. Some are surviving injuries that should be fatal." He leaned forward. "I don't know exactly what you're doing out there, and I suspect I don't want to know officially. But I need you to understand something. There are people in this command who want to shut down whatever this is. They see it as collaboration with the enemy. They see it as undermining the war effort. And you, sir?" "I see casualty figures," the colonel said. "I see soldiers going home alive who should be dead. I see a unit that's maintaining effectiveness despite being undersupplied and overworked. I see results." He stood, walked to the window, looked out at nothing. "The war is ending, Captain. Maybe another month, maybe 2. When it's over, everyone involved in this unofficial medical network is going to face questions. There will be investigations. There might be courts-martial. I can't protect you from that. I understand, sir. But," the colonel turned back to face him, "there's something else you should understand. When this war ends, and people start counting the cost, they're going to discover something. They're going to discover that in some sectors, in some units, wounded soldiers had a better chance of survival than anywhere else on the front. And they're going to ask why." He walked back to his desk, pulled out a folder. "I've been documenting everything. Not to prosecute you. To defend you. Because when they ask why, I want to be able to show them exactly what you accomplished. Not in violation of medical ethics, but in service of them." Mitchell took the folder. It contained copies of casualty reports, survival rates, testimonies from wounded soldiers who had received care from both sides. It was evidence of something that shouldn't have been possible, proof of something that contradicted everything people believed about war. "Keep doing what you're doing," the colonel said. "Be smart. Be careful. But don't stop. Because what you've started might be the only decent thing to come out of this entire godforsaken war. Mitchell returned to his unit carrying the folder like a talisman, proof that someone in the command structure understood that the network wasn't just tolerated but quietly protected. He didn't know what would happen when the war ended. He didn't know if he would face prosecution or commendation. He only knew that he would continue doing what he had been doing, treating the wounded, regardless of uniform, regardless of orders, regardless of consequences. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. Not everyone survived their choice to help. On April 18, 1945, 3 weeks before the German surrender, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber was shot by an SS officer while attempting to treat an American prisoner. The details came to Mitchell through Hartmann, who risked crossing the lines to deliver the news personally. They met in no man's land at night, in the same place where they had first worked together on Christmas morning. He was operating on one of your soldiers, Hartmann explained, his voice hollow. A prisoner brought to our aid station with a chest wound. Weber was trying to save him. An SS officer came to the station, demanded to know why German medical supplies were being used on the enemy. Weber refused to stop the surgery. The SS officer shot him. Right there in the operating tent. Mitchell felt something crack inside him. He had never met Weber personally, but he knew his reputation. Weber had saved dozens of Allied soldiers. He had shared his supplies when he had nothing to spare. He had risked everything to maintain the network. The American prisoner? Mitchell asked. Dead. Shot by the same officer after Weber fell. Hartmann's hands were shaking. We could do nothing. The SS has authority over medical personnel now. They are executing anyone they suspect of defeatism or collaboration. How many others? Mitchell asked quietly. 3 that I know of. Dr. Kraus was arrested last week. We do not know his status. 2 nurses in Belgium were executed for treating British wounded. There may be others. The SS is purging anyone they believe is undermining the war effort. They stood in silence. Around them, the war continued its mechanical processes, artillery fire in the distance, the rumble of tanks, the sounds that had become so constant they almost disappeared into background noise. But Weber's death wasn't background noise. It was a direct consequence of choosing humanity in a system designed to destroy it. I am sorry I brought you this news, Hartmann said. But I thought you should know. Weber spoke of you, of what happened on Christmas. He said it gave him permission to continue doing what he believed was right. It got him killed. Yes, Hartmann agreed. But it also saved lives. Many lives. American, British, French, even Russian prisoners. He believed that saving life was worth the risk. Even at the end, even when the SS officer had a gun to his head, he believed it. Mitchell thought about the colonel's folder, about the survival rates, about the soldiers who would go home because of what Weber and others like him had done. He thought about the price of that compassion, paid not in supplies or risks but in lives. What will you do now? Mitchell asked. Continue, Hartmann said simply. What else can I do? Stop treating wounded because some officer thinks it makes me a traitor? Let men die because their uniform is the wrong color? I cannot. I have seen too much. I know what is possible now. You could be shot. Yes. Hartmann looked at him directly. So could you. The war is ending, Captain. When it ends, there will be questions. Someone will ask why you collaborated with the enemy. Someone will demand consequences. I know. And still you continue. What else can I do? Mitchell echoed Hartmann's words back to him. I'm a doctor. That comes before everything else. They shook hands, an unnecessary gesture that had become a ritual for them, a way of acknowledging that they were bound by something stronger than nationality or military law. Then Hartmann disappeared back into the darkness, returning to a German army that was disintegrating, to an aid station that might be shut down tomorrow, to a war that had already lost all meaning except the meaning they gave it by choosing to save rather than destroy. Mitchell returned to his tent. He pulled out the folder the colonel had given him, looked through the documents by flashlight. Survival rates. Testimonies. Evidence of what the network had accomplished. But it didn't mention Weber. It didn't mention the nurses in Belgium. It didn't mention the price paid by those who had chosen compassion in a system built on destruction. He added a note to the file. Just a few lines, stating the facts. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, German medical officer, killed while treating an Allied prisoner. Executed by his own forces for refusing to let a wounded man die. Age 31. Trained at Heidelberg. Father of 2. The note would probably be removed from the file if it ever became official. It was the wrong kind of information, too complicated, too sympathetic to the enemy, too honest about the cost of choosing humanity in the middle of war. But Mitchell wrote it anyway, because Weber deserved to be remembered, because the truth deserved to be documented even if it was later erased. Over the next 2 weeks, more news reached Mitchell about the network's casualties. A French doctor arrested for hiding German wounded in his clinic. A Polish nurse beaten by Soviet soldiers for treating Germans. A British medic court-martialed for sharing morphine with enemy prisoners. The network was being crushed from both sides, by German authorities who saw it as defeatism, by Allied authorities who saw it as collaboration, by the simple fact that war couldn't tolerate mercy without destroying itself. Every act of humanity in combat was a small rebellion against the fundamental logic of organized violence. And yet, the network continued. Diminished, hunted, underground, it continued. Because the alternative was to accept that in war, doctors became soldiers, that the sick and wounded became categories rather than people, that nationality mattered more than suffering. Mitchell received his last signal from the German side on April 29, 3 red flares, asking for plasma. He loaded the supplies personally, crossed no man's land one final time, knowing it was probably the last time, knowing that tomorrow or the next day the war would end and everything would change. He found Hartmann at the German aid station, treating wounded soldiers with supplies that had run out days earlier. The tent was collapsing. The generator had failed. They were operating by lamplight, using bandages made from torn uniforms, administering morphine diluted to the point of uselessness. "Thank you for coming," Hartmann said. "I did not think you would. I thought, perhaps, it was too dangerous now." "It was always too dangerous," Mitchell said. They administered the plasma together, moving through the German wounded with the efficiency of practice. Some of the soldiers were too far gone. Some would survive if they received better care in the coming days. Some were in the twilight between life and death, waiting for factors beyond anyone's control to decide their fate. As they worked, Hartmann spoke quietly. "When the war ends, what will you do?" "I don't know," Mitchell admitted. "Return to practice, probably. Try to forget all of this." "You will not forget." "No," Mitchell agreed. "I won't." "Neither will I." Hartmann finished bandaging a young soldier's leg. "I will remember that in the worst place, at the worst time, some people chose to remain human. That will have to be enough." They parted as dawn broke over a war that was finally, mercifully, dying. Mitchell crossed no man's land for the last time, carrying the weight of names: Weber, Krauss, the nurses in Belgium, the doctors arrested or executed or disappeared. The cost of compassion, measured in lives of those who refused to stop caring. Behind him, the German aid station collapsed in on itself as artillery found its range. He didn't see what happened to Hartmann. He never saw him again. The war ended 4 days later, and with it, the possibility of crossing the lines, of meeting in the darkness, of remembering together what they had done. But the memory remained. And the cost remained. And the question remained, was it worth it? Mitchell would spend the rest of his life trying to answer that question. The German surrender came on May 8, 1945, in a school building in Reims, France. Mitchell heard about it through the radio, standing in an aid station that was no longer treating combat casualties but processing displaced persons, former prisoners, civilians emerging from cellars where they had hidden for months. The war was over. The killing had stopped. The silence was deafening. Within days, his unit received orders to begin documenting German medical facilities, cataloging supplies, preparing reports for the occupying forces. Mitchell found himself walking through abandoned German aid stations, seeing the same equipment he had used, the same improvised solutions, the same desperate attempts to save lives with insufficient resources. He found no trace of Hartmann. He asked everyone he encountered, but no one knew what had happened to the German medic who had crossed the lines on Christmas night. Perhaps he had survived. Perhaps he had disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Perhaps he was among the thousands of unidentified dead being buried in mass graves across Europe. Mitchell returned to the United States in July 1945. He was welcomed home as a hero, decorated for his service, praised for his unit's low casualty rates. No one asked about the network. No one questioned the survival rates that were statistically improbable. No one wanted to know the complicated truth behind the simple narrative of victory. He returned to practice in Philadelphia. He married. He had 3 children. He became a successful surgeon, respected in his field, known for his skill and compassion. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in the Hürtgen Forest. But in 1947, he received a letter. It came from London, forwarded through medical societies, marked with the names of several intermediaries who had tracked him down. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The return address meant nothing to him. He almost discarded it as another veteran seeking medical advice. Instead, he opened it. And he read. Dear Captain Mitchell, you do not know me, but I know of you. I was a patient at the German aid station you visited in March 1945. I was 18 years old, had lost my leg, was dying from infection. You treated me. You gave me sulfa powder and morphine. You probably do not remember, I was just another wounded soldier among thousands. I survived. After the war, I was repatriated to England, where my mother had emigrated in 1938. I am now studying medicine at Cambridge. I write to tell you that I am alive because you chose to treat an enemy. I write to thank you. I write to ask if you know what happened to the German medics who worked with you. I have spent 2 years searching for information about Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann. I believe he saved my life before you finished the work. I believe he is the reason I was still breathing when you arrived. I would like to thank him, if he is still alive. If he is dead, I would like to know where he is buried, so I can place flowers there. Do you have any information? Does anyone? The world seems eager to forget the war, to move forward, to stop asking questions about who died and why. But I cannot forget. I owe my life to men who should have been enemies. If you have any information, please write. If you know nothing, please know that I remember. I will always remember. Yours in gratitude, Michael Schneider, formerly Michael Schmidt. Mitchell sat at his desk for an hour, holding the letter, reading it repeatedly. He thought about Hartmann's cracked glasses, his exhausted eyes, his hands that moved with the same desperate skill Mitchell recognized in himself. He thought about the last time he had seen the German medic, working by lamplight in a collapsing tent, using the final supplies to save one more life, knowing that tomorrow might bring arrest or execution or simply the end of everything. He wrote back. He told Schneider what he knew, which was very little. He described Hartmann as best he could remember. He provided no information about the network, no details that could be used to prosecute anyone who might have survived. He simply acknowledged that yes, he had worked with German medics, and yes, they had saved lives together. The correspondence continued for years. Through Schneider, Mitchell learned fragments of what had happened to others in the network. Dr. Krauss had survived the SS arrest, had been liberated by American forces, and was now practicing in West Berlin. Lieutenant Ashworth had returned to England, was running a clinic for wounded veterans. The French doctor had been executed, not by the Germans, but by French resistance fighters who accused him of collaboration. Each piece of news was a small revelation, a fragment of the larger story that no one wanted to tell officially. The war had ended, but the consequences of what they had done continued, rippling outward in ways they hadn't anticipated. In 1953, Mitchell received an invitation to speak at a medical conference in London. The topic was battlefield medicine, innovations developed during the war. He almost declined. He had no desire to discuss what he had learned in the Hürtgen Forest, no interest in turning trauma into academic presentations. But Schneider would be there. And Ashworth had agreed to attend. And Krauss was traveling from Berlin specifically to participate. They wanted to meet, to remember together, to finally speak openly about what had happened in the darkness between the armies. Mitchell accepted. The conference was professional, sterile, focused on techniques and statistics. But on the final evening, in a small restaurant away from the official proceedings, 5 people gathered: Mitchell, Schneider, Ashworth, Krauss, and one other, a French nurse named Marie Leclerc, who had been part of the network, who had carried wounded across the lines, who had survived the accusations of collaboration but not the social ostracism that followed. They sat together for 4 hours. They drank wine that tasted like memory. They told stories that had been locked inside them for 8 years, stories about signals in the darkness, about surgeries performed by enemies working as colleagues, about small acts of mercy in a war designed to destroy mercy. And they mourned. They mourned Weber, shot for refusing to let a prisoner die. They mourned the nurses executed for treating the wrong wounded. They mourned the French doctor killed for remembering that suffering transcended nationality. They mourned Hartmann, whose fate remained unknown, who had disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. I searched for him, Krauss said quietly. For 3 years after the war, I searched. I checked prisoner lists, displaced person camps, grave registrations. There is no record. He simply vanished. Perhaps he survived, Mitchell said. Perhaps he's in East Germany, or Russia, or somewhere we cannot reach. Perhaps, Krauss agreed, but no one believed it. They had all seen too much death to believe in unlikely survivals. As the evening ended, they made a pact. They would document what had happened, not officially, not for public consumption, but for themselves, for the memory of those who had paid the price for choosing compassion. They would write down the names, the dates, the locations. They would preserve the truth even if the world wasn't ready to hear it. Mitchell returned to Philadelphia carrying that responsibility. He spent the next decade collecting testimonies from medics who had been part of the network, from soldiers who had been treated by enemy doctors, from anyone who remembered that in the worst moments of the war, some people had chosen to remain human. He never published the documents. They remained in his study, in a folder that grew thicker each year, filled with stories that contradicted the simple narratives of victory and defeat. He thought about publishing them, about making the story public, about forcing the world to acknowledge what had happened. But he never did. Because the cost had been too high. Because those who had died for their compassion deserved better than to have their deaths turned into lessons or moralizing or political statements. Because the truth was too complicated for easy consumption, too nuanced for a world that wanted simple heroes and simple villains. The folder remained in his study until his death in 1983. His children found it while clearing his house. They read the testimonies, the letters, the careful documentation of a network that had operated in the shadows of war, that had saved lives at tremendous cost, that had proved something important and dangerous about the limits of military authority over medical ethics. They donated the documents to a medical history archive, where they remained largely unexamined for another 2 decades, just another collection from another war, another set of stories that seemed too strange to be fully believed. But the truth remained. And the memory remained. And in that memory, in that carefully preserved documentation, something essential was saved from the war, not victory or defeat, not tactics or strategies, but the simple fact that in the darkness between the armies, some people had chosen to see wounded patients instead of enemy soldiers, had chosen healing over hatred, had chosen to remain doctors when the world demanded they become soldiers. That choice had cost some of them everything. But it had also proved something fundamental about human nature, that even in the worst circumstances, even when authority demanded cruelty and systems promoted destruction, some people would still choose compassion. And that choice mattered. It mattered then. It matters now. It will matter in every future war, in every future moment when people are asked to choose between humanity and obedience. The network had been crushed. The war had ended. The silence had fallen. But what had been proved in that silence couldn't be erased. Humanity, once chosen, leaves traces. And those traces endure. In 2004, a graduate student at Cambridge was researching battlefield medicine when he discovered Mitchell's archived documents. The student, working on a dissertation about medical ethics in combat, had expected to find standard accounts of triage protocols and surgical innovations. Instead, he found evidence of something unprecedented, a systematic network of medical cooperation between enemies, operating across the front lines of World War II, sustained for months despite military law that prohibited exactly what they were doing. He brought the documents to his advisor, who brought them to colleagues, who brought them to historians, who finally brought them to public attention. A small article appeared in a medical journal. Then a larger piece in a history publication. Then a documentary. Then books. The world, 60 years after the fact, learned about the medics who had crossed the lines, about the signals in the darkness, about the surgeries performed by enemies working together, about the price paid by those who chose compassion over compliance. The reactions were complicated. Some celebrated it as proof of humanity's resilience in war. Some criticized it as collaboration with the enemy, as a betrayal of military discipline that could have undermined the war effort. Some simply felt confused by the contradiction. How could helping the enemy be right when the war against Nazi Germany was so clearly necessary? The debate revealed something important. Even decades later, even knowing how the war ended, even with the benefit of historical distance, people struggled to reconcile the network's existence with their understanding of how wars should work. But for those who had been saved, the soldiers who survived because enemy medics treated their wounds, the prisoners who lived because someone on the other side remembered they were human, the families who got their loved ones back because a doctor chose patience over politics, the debate seemed beside the point. They were alive. That was all that mattered. In 2006, a ceremony was held at the Imperial War Museum in London. It honored the medics of the network, those who had survived and those who had died for their choice. Schneider, now an elderly physician himself, attended. Krauss had died the previous year, but his daughter came in his place. Mitchell's children were there, along with families of the nurses who had been executed, relatives of the doctors who had disappeared. During the ceremony, something unexpected happened. An elderly German man approached Schneider, asking to speak with him. The man was frail, walked with difficulty, spoke English with a heavy accent that time hadn't softened. "I am Friedrich Weber Jr., he said. "My father was Hauptmann Weber. I understand you are researching the network. I thought you should have this." He handed Schneider a small journal, worn from years of handling. It contained entries from Weber's time as a medical officer, including detailed notes about the soldiers he had treated, German, American, British, Russian, French. The entries were clinical, professional, focused on medical procedures rather than emotions. But on the final page, written in different ink, as if added later, was a single paragraph. "I do not know if what we are doing is right by military law. I know only that I am a doctor, and doctors treat the wounded. If this principle is wrong in war, then war itself must be questioned. I would rather face execution for saving a life than live with the knowledge that I let someone die because of their uniform. This is my choice. I do not regret it." It was dated April 17, 1945, one day before Weber was shot by the SS officer. Schneider read the passage aloud at the ceremony. The room fell silent. Some wept. Some simply stood, bearing witness to words written by a man who knew he might die for his principles but chose them anyway. After the ceremony, journalists asked the inevitable questions: was it right? Did helping enemy wounded prolong the war? Did saving Germans cost Allied lives? Should military law permit this kind of cooperation? Schneider, asked for his response, simply lifted his pant leg to reveal his prosthetic limb. "I am alive," he said, "because a German medic named Hartmann treated me when I should have been left to die, and because an American doctor named Mitchell finished saving me when he could have let me suffer. Everything else is philosophy. I am alive. That is what remains." The historical judgment on the network remains complicated. Military historians debate whether it represented an admirable act of humanity or a dangerous precedent that undermined military discipline. Ethicists argue about whether doctors in war zones have obligations that supersede military authority. Politicians invoke it as evidence for various positions on the laws of war. But for the medics themselves, for the few who survived long enough to see their story recognized, the debate always seemed to miss the point. They hadn't been making a political statement. They hadn't been trying to undermine the war effort. They had simply been trying to remember who they were beneath the uniform: doctors, healers, people who had chosen a profession defined by the preservation of life. War had demanded they forget that identity. The network had been their way of refusing that demand. In 2010, a memorial was established at the site where Mitchell and Hartmann first met on Christmas night, 1944. It consists of two hands reaching toward each other across a small stone wall, one hand wearing an American medic's glove, one wearing a German medic's glove, both reaching toward a wounded soldier carved in the stone between them. The inscription reads simply, "They remembered they were healers first." The memorial stands in what is now a peaceful forest, where trees have grown over the ruins of war, where the craters have been softened by time and weather, where the silence is no longer the silence of death but the silence of healing. Visitors leave flowers there, red poppies for remembrance, white lilies for peace, yellow roses for friendship. Some visitors are historians or students, coming to understand a complicated episode in the history of war. Some are descendants of those who were saved by the network, coming to honor the medics who gave their families back. Some are simply people who heard the story and felt moved by it, by the idea that even in humanity's darkest moments, some people choose light. And sometimes, rarely, elderly men and women arrive at the memorial and stand for long minutes in silence. They don't identify themselves. They don't tell their stories. They simply stand, remembering what they witnessed or experienced, what it cost, what it proved. They remember the signals in the darkness. The surgeries performed by enemies. The supplies shared when there was nothing to spare. The lives saved at tremendous risk. The colleagues executed for their compassion. The silence that fell when the war ended and everyone wanted to forget the complicated truths that didn't fit simple narratives. They remember that in the Hürtgen Forest, in the winter of 1944, in the midst of one of history's most destructive wars, some people proved that nationality was not destiny, that uniforms did not define humanity, that even systems designed to promote killing could not completely destroy the choice to heal. This is what remains. Not a policy. Not a precedent. Not a solution to the problem of war. Just a memory, carefully preserved, passed down through generations, telling us something essential about who we are and who we can choose to be, even when everything around us demands we choose otherwise. The war ended 75 years ago. The medics are gone. The wounded have healed or died. The hospitals have closed. The signals are no longer sent across the darkness between armies. But the choice they made, to see patients before enemies, to honor their calling above their orders, to remain healers in a world demanding they become killers, that choice echoes still. In every medical tent, in every conflict. In every moment when a doctor must decide between protocols and patients. In every situation where authority demands one action but humanity demands another. The echo continues. The memory endures. The question remains. When the world demands you choose sides, can you choose humanity instead? They proved you can. They paid the price. They left the evidence. And in that evidence, carefully preserved, passed down, remembered, lies a truth more powerful than any weapon deployed in that war. Compassion, once chosen, cannot be completely destroyed. It survives in memory. It survives in stories. It survives in the simple fact that some people, when given the choice between cruelty and kindness, between obedience and mercy, between following orders and following their conscience, chose the harder path. They chose to remain human. That is what remains. That is all that matters. That is everything.